Okay, welcome to week number 42 of this cycle of the Big Book Comes Alive Step Study Workshop. My name is Howard Eber, and I am an alcoholic. Um, we are we're into action. We're getting busy. Um, I always like to do a bit of review before we get started. Um, if I go back to page 60. I know it's a big leap, but if we go back to page 60, let's see if we can connect some dots here. On page 60, Bill gave us an ABC. He gave us three things that we had to be convinced of. There's a number of convinces that I want to draw your attention to, and this is one of the first, where he says that if you've done the work up until this point. I people ask me every once in a while, how do you work the first the first two steps? There's no instructions in the book. How do you do that? Well, it's not a working, those aren't working steps. Steps one and two and even three are conclusions of the mind. We read everything up to this page, as it says on page 60. If we have read the description to the alcoholic, if we have read the chapter to the agnostic and the personal adventures, then we have become convinced of three pertinent ideas. If we have become convinced, I should say, that we are alcoholic and could not manage our own lives, which is step one. It's just an admission. It's a way of saying, I can't fix me. B, that probably no human power could ever relieve our alcoholism, which is part of step two, which is, I like to think of concession. If A is admission, then B is concession. And C, which I like to think is recognition, is that God can and would if he were sought. So we have A, B, and C, which is admission, concession, and recognition. And if we want to really simplify it, A, B, C basically means I can't, he can, and it's not, so I think I'll let him. I hear that too often. That's not what C says. C says that if he were sought. So for me, A is I can't, B is he can, and C is I'm going to let him. I better let him. I better go find him. That's what if he were sought means. I better go find him. Um, and then it says we're being convinced of those three things. We're at step three, which we decided to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood him. So we are convinced of these things. And basically, what does that boil down to? Well, if we take a look at the next paragraph, it says, being convinced that any life run on self will can hardly be a success. So if we've acknowledged A, B, and C, then we are also acknowledging that any life based on self can hardly be a success. That when we make decisions based on self, something happens. And he says it in the next sentence. He says that when we are almost always in collision with somebody or something. If I try and force my will on you or in a given situation, there's going to be a reaction because I've got my playbook and you've got your playbook. And there are 100 and somewhat other people here who have their own playbooks, and you're not going to let me just waltz right in and take over. There's going to be a reaction. And that's what Bill is mentioning means when he says that we're in collision with somebody or something. We're in collision with one of the three basic dimensions of life. We're in collision we're in collision, in disharmony, if you will, spiritually, mentally, physically. And when we're colliding with those forces, when I step on your toes by trying to force my will on a situation, what happens? When I step on your toes, right away, get off my foot, push, there's retaliation. That's the way Bill termed it. There's retaliation. And when you retaliate, what do? I'm entitled to my own retaliation. And what does my retaliation look like? I get angry. I get fearful. I act in a manner that's harmful to me and other people. In other words, I get resentful. And when I'm resentful, history has shown that I will drink or I will drug. So if we want to change those actions in our lives, we have to change the thinking that led to those actions. Um, as I said, Bill mentioned any life run on self will. Um, let's take a look at page. Let's go to the next page. I'm sorry. Let's go to page 62. He said, any life based on self. Well, what does that look like? At this point in the book, what does it look like? Well, he says on page 62, paragraph 1, selfish, self-centeredness is the root of our problems. So that gets a little closer to identifying what a life run on self-will is. But let's take it a little further. He says, driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, self-pity, we step on the toes of our fellows, as I mentioned before, and they retaliate. So we're being driven by these things. Mark Houston has a great analogy for that. It's like he comes down out of his hotel in the morning and there's a limousine waiting in front of the hotel. And the driver comes out and he walks around and he opens the door for him and he says, Mr. Houston, my name is Fear. I'm going to be driving you around all day today. And he drives him around every place he goes and leaves him at the hotel at night. And the next day, he comes to the front door and there's another limousine driver and he says, Mr. Houston, my name is self-seeking, self-delusion. I'm going to drive you around today. And that's what it looks like is we're being driven, we're being controlled. If I'm being driven, I'm not in the driver's seat. So I'm being driven by these forms of self. And then in the next page, yep, page 63, we say what is considered to be the third step prayer. I'm going to take it a step backwards to the bottom of page 62, if you will indulge me for a moment. He says something at the bottom of page 62 that's critically important. At least was for me. It was a real eye opener for me. He says that God is the director. God is the principal. God is the father. And if you haven't circled those words in that paragraph, I'm going to suggest you do that. God is the director. God is the principal. God is the father. That means he's a number one guy. I am, as in Bill's words, his agents, meaning I work for him. That's what an agent is. I work for the client, and the client is God. And the reason why that impacted me so much is for 24 years in recovery, I started out each day by saying, God, I turn my will over to you. And these are the things I need to get done today. I had my list together and I thought I was doing the right thing. I was telling God what I needed him to do. And at night, I took out my list because I'm a compulsive list maker and I always have near me. And he obviously didn't have his list handy. So I went over it and I said, God, nothing really changed today, but I'm a nice guy. We'll give it a chance tomorrow. And that really changed things for me, is recognizing that I am not the number one guy. I am not the one giving the orders. God is not my errand boy. I am the number two person. When Bill mentions that we're like an actor who's trying to manage everything on stage, that's the actor is the number two guy. He's not in charge. The person who is in charge is the director. He's the one who controls the lights, the scenery, everyone else's actions. That's the number one guy. So I came in here thinking I'm the number one guy, but I'm number two. So if I grasp what's on the bottom of page 62, the top of page 63 tells me something's going to happen. These are promises, but I like to think of them as pre-step 3 promises, that they kind of come before that, because it's based on our accepting the conditions, if you will, that Bill gave us on the previous page. And that's what he says, is that when we sincerely took such a position, what position is that? God's the director, he's the father, he's number one guy, I'm number two guy. When I sincerely took that position, all sorts of remarkable things follow. I had a new employer, there's a new boss. And like any new job you take, when there's a new boss or a new job, you're handed a job description. You're told what your job is. So when I think I'm number one, what I'm about to read told me otherwise again. He said, we had a new employer being all powerful. He provided what we needed, and underline that word needed, not wanted. I believe God isn't the least bit concerned with what I want. I don't think he gives two shits about what I want. His job is to making sure I get what I need. And I'll be damned, I get what I need every day. Unbelievable. But he says, here's the condition. He provided what we needed if, here's the job description, keep close to him and perform his work well. One of the workshops we were in recently, somebody pointed out that, first of all, this whole paragraph that we're reading is a promise. These are all promises. But somebody suggested that that phrase, performed if we kept close to him and performed his work well, should be considered a must. Now, that's an interesting thought. So if you want to make it a must, highlight it in green in your book. I haven't quite given into it yet, but we highlight the musts in green, and I think we got 140 of them so far, because there are a lot of musts in this book. But there's the condition. If we kept close to him and performed his work well, established on such a footing, I became less and less interested in myself, my little plans and designs. More and more, I became interested in seeing what, and incidentally, you may notice I've personalized that. This paragraph is real close to home for me. So all the we's have become I's. What I can contribute to life, as I felt new power flow in, as I enjoyed peace of mind, as I discovered I could face life successfully, as I became conscious of his presence, I began to lose my fear of today, tomorrow, and the hereafter. We were reborn. And then we get to the step 3 prayer, which says, God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self. Basically, that's release me. That's what relieve me means. Release me of the slavery of self. I know that's not what it says, but that is what it says. Relieve me of the bondage of self is meaning release me from the slavery of self, that I may better do thy will. Hang on, I just lost. Oops. Okay. Relieve me with the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. This is important. Take away my difficulties. Keep that word in mind, that difficulties word, if you will, for a moment. Take away my difficulties, that victory, not surrender, victory over them may bear witness to those I would help, of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. So it sounds like the measure of a successful life is how I can demonstrate God's will in my life, that I can demonstrate his power, his love, his way of life, always. That's my job. Now, there was a line that I pointed out, said, take away my difficulties. And when he says, take away my difficulties, I don't think he's referring to, well, some of the other terms he uses in the book, like worldly clamors, life's certain trials and low spots, life's vicissitudes, the pressures and difficulties of everyday life. No, I don't think that's what he's talking about. I did for a long time think that's what he meant. We got difficulties. There are all of these various things, but these are things that seem to happen to us. And the real difficulties are our own making. So if I look at it that way, that what are we referring to when we say difficulties? Let's take a look. Let's go back a page to page 62. And I know we read it already, but let's look at it again. Here's the difficulties. Selfish, self-centeredness. That's the root of our trouble. Take away that difficulty. All these other difficulties, things that happen to us like selfishness, self-centeredness of our own making. And then it says driven by 100 forms, as we read before, of fear, self. This is what we're talking about in terms of difficulty. The problems that are all of our own making. They don't happen to us. They're not coming at us. They're coming from us. And that's an important part for me to grasp, that these difficulties are not the things that come at me. They're the things that come from me, because I seem to set everything else in motion. Let's go to page 64. We're getting close. We're getting close. I was talking about being convinced. Paragraph 2 that begins with, we did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in the makeup of our makeup, which caused our failure. And here's the important part of the sentence. Being convinced that self, once again, we're convinced. A couple of pages ago, we're convinced of A, B, and C. Now he's just reminding us what that looks like. Being convinced that self that looks like manifests in various ways, and above various ways, you may want to write, see page 62, paragraph 1 and 2, because he lays it out there. What are the various ways? 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, self-pity, selfishness, self-centeredness. The beginning of page 60 of the next paragraph, our troubles are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot. I don't have to keep reading that over and over again, but I believe that's what he's saying here. Being convinced that self manifested in various ways, page 62, paragraph 1 and 2, was what had defeated us. If we acknowledge that, here's another consideration. We considered its common manifestations. So over the course of these few pages, I think we've taken some giant steps towards this inventory that we're going to have to go through to find out the things in our character that are blocking us from God, the things that are piling up on our soul, that are keeping God from getting out, because God isn't out here. God is in here. We learned that on page 55, that every deep down in every man, woman, and child is that fundamental concept, and it's innate, which means it's in every one of us. It's born in us. So if God is in us, we have to clear away the crap that's accumulated over our soul that's preventing him from getting out. God's not out here. He doesn't need to get let in. He needs to get let out from here. But what I said is that he's kind of given us these little steps. First, he's saying that self is the core of our problem. And then he defines it a little bit more. He says, it looks like this. It's 100 forms of fear, self-delusion. Anything begins with self. And then he starts to identify a little bit more about that when he mentions these difficulties that we have. all self-made. And that brings me to, as I said on page 64, it says, being convinced that self in various ways was what had defeated us, we considered its common manifestations. At first, those common manifestations were selfish self-centeredness. And then a little while later, they manifested as 100 forms of fear and self. And then we're told that these things are basically of our own making. That's how we're starting to identify the common manifestations of what had led to our downfall. So when he said, being convinced that self in many ways, we just mentioned those different ways, was what had defeated us, we considered its common manifestations. Now, having said all of that, maybe this makes more sense. The common manifestations are our angers, our fears, and the sources of guilt and shame that we carry around with us because of the harms that we've done. That's how these things manifest itself. And I'll maybe put it another way. Maybe it's easier to digest. It was for me thinking of it this way, that as I look back on my life, I cannot identify a single emotional disturbance that didn't have to do with one of three following things. One, I'm angry as hell about something. I'm pissed off. Two, I'm scared to death about something. Whether I know what it is or not, it doesn't matter. I'm carrying around that fear. And the third thing is that I'm filled with guilt and shame and remorse because of things I've done that I'm afraid you're going to find out about and I'm going to be held responsible for. So if that's the case, the common manifestations of my problems that have been of my own making are all rooted in my angers, my fears, and the sources of guilt and shame I carry as a result of the harms that I've done other people. And that helped me understand why we're about to make these stupid lists. What does anger, what does fear, what does sex conduct have to do with my drinking? Now I understand. Now I understand. So when I look at it that way, going on to the next paragraph, he says, resentment's the number one offender. And resentment is just re-feeling. We're re-feeling all of these common manifestations. From the minute we achieve consciousness in the morning, we're weaving these plots of revenge. We're thinking of, I can't believe that son of a bitch did this, or I'm going to do this to him and I'm going to get even. And we're weaving these plots of resentments. And resentments show up as angers, fears, and harmful acts that cause guilt and shame and remorse. All of those are resentments. I know it's common in meetings if the topic is resentment, everyone talks about anger as if anger equals resentment and resentment equals anger. I don't think so. I think anger is a resentment. So is fear. So is guilt and shame that we're carrying as a result of the harms we've done. The resentment is just our replaying it over and over, our failure to get past it, accept it, leave it, whatever it is. It still remains with us. So anger is only one of those forms. So he begins this paragraph by telling us resentment's the number one offender. From it stem all forms of spiritual dis-ease, for we've been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. Three dimensions. We have been mentally sick, that is our obsession. We have been physically ill, that is our allergy, our craving. And we have been spiritually sick, and that is our spiritual malady. And then he tells us the opposite, that when the spiritual malady is overcome, spiritual malady is steps 1, 2, and 3. when we get straight in steps 1, 2, and 3, when the spiritual malady is overcome, what happens? We then straighten out mentally, steps 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then what happens? After we get right with God, and then we get right with ourselves, the next step is to get right physically. And that's not going in for a physical and checking your blood pressure and all that stuff, although you could consider it that if you want. When this book talks about physical, the physical dimension, Bill is talking about how we as people integrate with the rest of humanity. That's what physical is, the physical world. And notice the order. First, we get right spiritually, then we get right mentally, and then we get right physically. I think I said that right. I think I may have reversed it. First, we get right spiritually, then mentally, then physically. And there's a funny thing that I've noticed. That's the way we get well, right? Spiritually, mentally, physically. What's the first warning sign? I'll ask myself. When I feel I'm starting to like become unhealthy, to become disconnected, when I don't feel the connections that I should feel, how does it manifest itself? How do I know I'm heading for rough water? I begin to have trouble with personal relationships. Number one, I know I'm starting to come apart when all I do is look at you and see all of the things that you're doing wrong and the things that you're doing to me and the things that you aren't doing. I focus on you. I begin to have trouble with personal relationships. And if we go down the rest of the things on page 52, it follows perfectly in order. So everything, we get well a certain way and we fall apart a certain way, but that's neither here nor there. So he gives us an assignment. The first one is to look at our angers. And let's now get to the bottom of page 65, if you would, where Bill says, we went back through our lives, which means starting with today, working backwards. Nothing counted but thorough and honesty, meaning we don't consciously leave something out of our inventory. When we were finished, here we go again. We considered it carefully. The whole next page, this page 66, tells us how to consider what it is we've written in these first few columns. And what does it mean? And what it means is, he said, the first thing that it was apparent was this world and its people, which is column 1 of our inventory lists, were often quite wrong, which is column 2 of our inventory list. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got, which is referring to column 1. And that's as far as I ever got. If you're wrong, if you've wronged me, then I must be right. If I look at things in terms of wrongs, it's easy for me to convince myself of that you did something wrong to me, so I must be right. The usual outcome was people continued to wrong us. Column 1, the people, they wronged us. Column 2, and we stayed sick. Column 3. Continuing, I think where we are, we're getting closer to where I want to be here, but I spent a lot of time on that, and I didn't want to spend that much time. Yeah, we're going to go to page 75, if you don't mind. I'm sorry, page 72. Now, once we've done that, we've taken those inventories, those columns. There are 6 things that we notice that will have happened. as a result of doing that stuff. And Bill spells it out in the first paragraph on page 72. He says, having made our personal inventory, what do we do with it? Okay. We've been trying to get, number one, a new attitude. That's the first thing we get from this, is a new attitude. We are trying to get this spiritual relationship with our Creator. We are trying to live on a certain spiritual plane. And that's what this new attitude is again, I'm number two. I'm not the number one guy. And then here's number two, step three, a new relationship. So I've been trying to get a new attitude, which is step two, a new relationship, which is step three, with our Creator, and discover is number three, the obstacles in our path. Those are the step four resentments. Those are the obstacles in our path. That's also number three of the things we've accomplished, is we've discovered what they are. We've done our inventory, and that last column, that we're frightened, irresponsible, inconsiderate, dishonest, selfish, self-seeking, judgmental, those have been the obstacles in our path. And he said, we have admitted certain defects. That's number four. Admitted certain defects are those things in that last column that I mentioned a moment ago. And number five in the things we've discovered is we have ascertained in a rough way what the trouble is. There's no perfect fourth step. They're all rough. We do the best we can. And then we continue to take inventory over the course of the rest of our life to the rest of the steps. So the number five is we've done it in a rough way. And number six is we put our finger on the weak items in our inventory. The weak items in our inventory, those angers, those fears, those sources of guilt and shame. Now, these are about to be cast out. Tells us right away, when do we start the fifth step? Immediately. As soon as we have gone through those lists, we start our fifth step. Page 73. The bottom of the page, we must be entirely honest with somebody if we are expect to live long and happily in this world. Rightly and naturally, we think well before we choose the person or persons with whom to take this intimate and confidential step. Let me go back to the first part of that sentence. It said, we must be entirely. He couldn't have said we must be honest. He said entirely with somebody. Doesn't have to be everybody. I don't have to come into my home group and just blah on everything that's going on in my life. I could do that with my sponsor. I could do that with any number of people. I don't do that to the members of my home group. So I have to find somebody that I can be completely honest with. And what does completely honest look like? Andy, if you can give me 75 too. You have to be completely honest with somebody. I think most of us practice what I like to call iceberg honesty. I didn't realize that Sigmund Freud had thought of the same thing. So I guess great minds think alike. But the iceberg honesty that I'm referring to is that 10 or 15% of the iceberg that's above the surface, what we allow other people to know about us. We don't let them know everything about us. We let them know what we want them to know. And then under the surface, you see this humongous part of the iceberg, which is the other part that is unseen. It is below the surface. And this is what we keep to ourselves. And that 85, 90% will kill us. We need to find somebody who we can be honest about those things. And when I was reading about this, I read that Sigmund Freud talked about the unconscious, which is this part of the iceberg, is a reservoir of thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories. Wait, here it comes, that are hidden from awareness because they feel unacceptable. I don't share those things that are unacceptable, that are uncomfortable, that are awkward, that I don't want you to know about. That's what we're talking about. That part of our honesty has to be revealed to somebody. We can choose, obviously, who, but we need somebody to be completely honest with. And that way we could find a way around this iceberg honesty. Okay. Andy, you could take that down. Thank you very much. So we must be completely honest with somebody. Let's now turn to page 75, which is pretty much where we were. Page 75. When we decide who is to hear our story, this is the first paragraph, incidentally. This is telling us how to do it. I mentioned last week, this section is broken up into a few different areas. The first part of this chapter, Into Action, starts with telling us what we're trying to do. And then by the bottom of the page, it tells us the why we are doing it. And then by the top of page 74, it tells us who we're to do this with. And this paragraph, this section we're about to read, is talking about the how we do it. When we decide who is to hear our story, we waste no time. Incidentally, all of the uses of we in this paragraph, to me, mean God and I. Because again, the fifth step is admitted to God, to myself, and to another human being. Well, we're talking about who that human being is now. The we is me and God. We're waiting to get with that third person and go through this stuff. So the we's that we're coming upon here are a little bit different than the we's we encountered in the forward. We are more than 100 men and women. That's talking about the founders. This, in the fifth step, is talking about the team of God and I. So we decide who is to hear our story. We waste no time. We have a written inventory, and please underline inventory, because once again, inventory means an itemized list. Notice it doesn't say we have a written story. We have stacks of paper. Charlie Parmley talks about when he did his first fourth step, he had 98 pages, handwritten pages, front and back of the paper. So it's not really 98 pages. It's like 180 pages that told him nothing about how to change. It told all the biographical data, when he was born, how many people in the family, and so on, but nothing that we could use to learn to change. Inventory is what we're looking at. We're making a list of things. So we have a written list and we are prepared for a long talk. That's where the story enters into it. We tell our story through the context of those lists. We don't just tell all of the biographical data. We're talking about the stuff that's on our list. We explain to our partner why we have to do it, that we're engaged in a life and death errand. And here it is. We pocket our pride and go to it, illuminating every twist of character, every dark cranny of the past. That is our assignment for doing the fifth step. Now, the rest of this paragraph, I'm going to suggest you highlight in pink. because these are all promises. These are promises of the result of doing step 5. Once we have taken this step, withholding nothing, please underline or circle that, withholding nothing. Remember, the directions we were given in the 4th step were simply to be thorough and honest. Don't consciously omit anything. So, like any good teacher, he just repeats himself. Withholding nothing, we're delighted. We can look the world in the eye. Let's underline that. We can be alone. Please underline the word alone. At perfect peace and ease. Please underline the word ease. So when I am in my state of recovery, when I am spiritually fit, and I'm alone, I'm at peace and ease. When I am in my state of dis-ease, when I am by myself, I'm lonely. I'm not just alone at peace. I'm in a state of dis-ease and I'm lonely. I'm missing something. Our fears fall from us. We begin to feel the nearness of our Creator. Please underline that. We may have had certain spiritual beliefs, but now we begin to have a spiritual experience. The feeling that the drink problem has disappeared will often come strongly. We feel we're on the broad highway walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. Now, once we have done our 5th step, I assume we've found someone, we've sat, we've gone through it. What happened? Well, we've done a lot of work, right? We've done a lot of thinking in the first few steps. We've done a lot of soul searching in the 4th step. We've spilled our guts in the 5th step. We've done a lot of work up until this point. And I think we probably need a little rest. So Bill gives it to us. He gives us some time to kick back and take it easy. So he says, returning home, please underline this, we find a place where we can be quiet for an hour. So first of all, he's pretty chintzy when it comes to time. Gives us an hour. Whoop-de-doo. But he's not giving us an hour to kick back, get out the remote, and catch up with Game of Thrones or The Walking Dead or anything like that. He gives us an assignment. Again, Bill Wilson, the Jewish mother, always has something else you need to do. And here it is. He says, sitting down for an hour, what do? We carefully review what we've done. What have we done? Andy, if you please give me, I'm looking for, I think it's step 6, if you would. Yeah, 75.3, I think is the number we gave it. 75, is it 753? Yeah, there it is. What have we done? Again, we're sitting down for an hour. What have we done? Well, by admitting our powerlessness in step 1, that opens us up to the power in step 2, right? We got to admit powerlessness, and that leaves me open to believing that there's a power. Fill in that gap, that void. So believing in that power in step 2 prepares me for making the decision that I'm going to have to make in step 3. And then by making that decision in step 3, I'm now sent on a quest. I've got a mission to be rid of the things that have been blocking me from God in step 4. And by identifying those defects in step 4, we're prepared to admit them to God, to another human being in step 5. And then By recognizing the damage those thoughts have done in our lives, in step 5, we become, did I lose it? We become ready to have God remove them in step 6. Now, well, what do we mean by hold it, Andy. What do we mean by recognizing the damage those defective thoughts have had in our life? Now, by going through our 5th step, as we go through it with our sponsor, we're going to be looking at the damage that we've done by our actions. And here's what we're going to find: that driven by those defects, those self-will run riot, again, as we said before, that manifest themselves in being frightened, irresponsible, inconsiderate, dishonest, selfish, self-seeking, and judgmental. When I make a decision based on those elements, I make a decision based on my being selfish, my being self-seeking, my being judgmental, my being inconsiderate. And I make a decision based on that. Again, those are forms of me, self-centered. What's in it for me? What do I get? Me, 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 me. When I am the center of my decision, what happens? Well, we already saw it. We were in collision with somebody or something. Everyone's got self-will. You're not going to let me force mine on you. So what happens? I step on your toes and you push back, you retaliate. And when you retaliate, I get angry, I get fearful, I act in a harmful manner. And when I get resentful, I will drink or a drug. So if the action of drinking is the end result of those defective thoughts, then surely those things in that last column have now become objectionable to us. We have commenced to see their terrible destructiveness, is what Bill says on page 70. So the question as we lead into step 6 is, are we ready to turn them loose? Are we now ready to let God remove from us all the things we've admitted are objectionable? If we are, we're done with step 6 and it's on to step 7. Now let's talk about what step 6, thanks, Andy. Let's keep it there. Let's talk about what's being asked of us in step 6. Actually, I want to do this one first. Yeah, okay, let's do this first. There are 4 basic reasons we may not be entirely ready. One is that we've made a conscious decision that we'll never give up a specific character defect. How many of us have said, look, that's the way I am. I can't change. That's just the way it is. Well, we're playing God when we do that, but that's common. We're making a conscious decision that we can't give up that character defect. Next, we blame others, which means we've got some inventory to go back to do. If we're blaming others, I like your hat, Kev. Kevin, I like your hat. We blame others, situations, and institutions, which means we've got to go back to our anger list. Third, we rationalize. Our capacity to rationalize is unlimited. Before recovery, we spent years throwing up barriers against unpleasant realities. And finally, one of the reasons for not being entirely ready is denial. We seem to be totally unaware of our own contribution to our problems, which means we've got to go back to that 4th step. We've missed something. We get active in the 6th step when we get sick and tired of the effects our character defects have had, not on our past, but on our present lives. And in so doing, we must be willing to challenge and change those patterns of thought, speech, behavior that have gone unchallenged for 10, 20, 30 or more years. The 6th step is, quote, the step that separates the men from the boys. That's what Father Dowling, one of Bill's sponsors, said in the 12 and 12. The 6th and the 7th steps take us from the infancy of abstinence to the maturity of recovery. We actively seek and practice a new way of living, a new way of being, a new way of thinking, a new way of behaving, a new way of relating. Some wait until they're in so much pain, they choose to participate only enough to get the pain to stop, then revert back to their old patterns of living, being, thinking, behaving, relating. Can anyone identify with that? We stop just as long as we can, just to get the pain to stop, to get the noise to back down. Some think they can never be forgiven or relieved of their defects. As I said before, saying, this is what I am, I can't change. This conscious decision and rationalization is not humility. It's not us accepting our shortcomings. It's another form of playing God. It's a way of saying that my defects are more powerful than my higher power's forgiveness. By working the seventh step, we discover that these shortcomings are not more powerful than our higher power's ability to affect their change. The true action of the sixth and seventh step culminates in dropping the rock, letting go of all the stubborn, grasping, stupid, holding on to old patterns of behavior, thinking, and feeling that are harmful to our progress in recovery. You could take that down, Andy. And just to save some time, I want to read you something from the 12 and 12. Bill said, and Bert, if you want to make note, I'm on page 68 of the 12 and 12. I'm just trying to save some time. On page 68, it says, looking again at these defects, we're still unwilling to give up. We ought to erase the hard, fast lines that we have drawn. Perhaps we shall be obliged in some cases to say, how about this? To say, this I cannot give up yet. But we should never say to ourselves, this I will never give up. At the very least, we shall have to come to grips with some of the worst character defects and take action towards their removal as quickly as we can. The moment we say no, never, our minds close against the grace of God. Delay is dangerous. Rebellion is fatal. This is the exact point at which we abandon limited objectives and move towards God's will for us. And on page 66 of the 12 and 12, Bill wrote, we must recognize now that we exult in some of our defects. We really love them. Who, for example, doesn't like to feel just a little superior to the next fellow, or even quite a lot superior? Isn't it true that we like to let greed masquerade as ambition? To think of liking lust seems impossible. But how many men and women speak love with their lips and believe what they say so they can hide lust in the dark corner of their minds? And even while staying within conventional bounds, many people have to admit that their imaginary sex excursions are apt to be all dressed up in dreams of romance. Self-righteous anger can also be very enjoyable. This is in a perverse way. We can actually take satisfaction from the fact that many people annoy us. It brings a comfortable feeling of superiority. Gossip, barbed with anger, a polite form of murder by character assassination, has its satisfactions for us too. Let me repeat that one. Gossip, barbed with our anger, a polite form of murder by character assassination, has its satisfactions for us too. Here, we're not trying to help those people we criticize. We're trying to proclaim our own righteousness. How's that? Kind of takes you back on your feet. I used the phrase a minute ago, drop the rock. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. There's a couple of books with that title. The way it came about, just so you're aware, is I think it was Sandy Beach, but the story is based on a plane that went down in the ocean. And there's a group of survivors from the plane that got into a life raft and got safely away from the fuselage. And then there was somebody they noticed that jumped out of the door of the fuselage as it was sinking. And they kept calling to him to come over to their life raft. And they noticed that he'd take a stroke or so, and then he'd go down under the water and stay down for a little while. And then he'd come up, he'd pop up, and then he'd go down again after a few strokes, and he'd stay down a little bit longer. And each time he came up, it was for less time. And each time he went down under, it was for longer. And as he got close to the raft, they noticed he was carrying a sack on his back, a sack of rocks. And he got very close to the raft at one point, and he went down under. And he didn't pop up again so quickly. He was sinking and sinking. And finally, in a state of almost unconsciousness, as he was passing out, his hand let go of those rocks and he popped up in the water. And those people in the raft grabbed him and put him in the boat. That's me in the water. Those defects are the bags of rocks that I'm carrying with me that are killing me. And the people in the boat are you people telling me, put down the goddamn sack. It's killing you. You need to let go of that bag of rocks. And in the book, Bag of Rocks, if you happen to have it, it's a great book. Bert, I'm going to read to you one sentence from page 4. I love this. This is the Drop the Rock prayer. And again, it's on page 4. If you have this book, I'm sure you're going to go looking for it now that I'm telling you about it. The prayer is this: God, I don't care what I sound like or look like, who my partners are or where I live. I just don't want to be like this anymore. On your terms, in your time, please remake me as you will. Thank you. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? Now, I'm going to stop right there because we began a prayer on page 63, the third step prayer. And if you notice at the end of it, it says, thy will, thy love, thy way of, may I do thy will always. And there's no amen after that, which means that the third step prayer is a prayer that begins on page 63 and it ends on page 76. And we're going to see how that happens next week. But all of the things between those pages are how we get to page 76. Because on page 76 in the 7-step prayer, it says amen, which means so be it. And it says we have then completed step 7. So in a sense, we began step 7 on page 63. Or you could think we began step 3 on 63 and ended on 76. However you want to view it, we're going to go over the ending of that prayer and the beginning of change next week. So I'm going to stop the recording